Welcome to On Leadership, a midweek podcast from HTBB. We believe leadership is a posture, not a position, and in the same way postures can be improved, leaders can grow. We want to encourage you to keep going and to equip you with practical ways to grow as a leader. Thanks for tuning in to On Leadership.
Hey, welcome back to On Leadership. My name is Sarah.
And I'm Leon.
And we are your hosts. In the last episode, we talked about imposter syndrome. And both of us mentioned how it was someone around us that really helped us find the right way to go. For me, it was Joanna. She helped me figure out how to type out emails. Till today, she is still helping me send out emails.
Hi, Joanna.
Hi, Joanna. And for you, Leon, it was your wife, Andrea.
Yeah.
And I think that really got us to start thinking how important it is the people around us that shape us. And we believe that everyone is a leader. And so if we're saying that, then we're also saying that it's all the people around us that help us think how we should act, what we should say, and how we communicate to one another.
Right, exactly. And it all stems on relationship, right? I think in order for us to be able to lead well, I think we were discussing before we started rolling that, you need to be able to invest in relationship. But I think what we can talk about today is also how do we hold the balance between investing in relationship and also dealing with what some people might say is overly soft leadership. There's this idea that, shouldn't you separate kind of being friends and investing with relationship from being a leader? And I think there's some value to that argument as well. But ultimately, I think as first and foremost, if we are followers of Jesus, then that in itself is relational by nature because we worship a relational God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So naturally, I think if we are to use Jesus as a model for leadership, then obviously the way that we lead others also has to be anchored in relationship. But I think we can talk a bit later about, what some of this looks like in reality as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to kick us off with a quote from C.S. Lewis, who we're a huge fan of. He's absolutely brilliant. And this is what he said: "Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it's one of those things that give value to survival."
Ooh,
good quote.
Friendship is unnecessary, huh? What do you think that means? What do you feel about that?
I think, I feel a lot of things. I think, I think firstly, I think he's really highlighting that friendship can be seen as soft, like you said, and that it's unnecessary, that we don't need it, that as leaders we're meant to do everything on our own, that we're meant to lead, to show the way. But I think he's saying that it gives value to survival, and that philosophy, art, these are things that we live for. It's things that we enjoy. I know you, Leon, you are an artist yourself. Actually, I'd like to ask you, why do you think it's important that we put value to these things? You were the co-head of creative before this at HTBB. You've got an eye for wanting to bring out the creative side of things. Why do you think that that's important?
I think there's an intentionality to be able to create. And, similar to that quote, it is, if you go by simple virtue of what necessary means. I mean, can I continue to live without art? Yes. Can humans continue to live without any sort of creative outlet? Of course they can. But that tells you that there's an intentionality with it. And we do it because, we create out of an overflow. As Christians, we do things out of an overflow of knowing that we are loved by Jesus. In the same way, even if you are non-religious as a creative, whether you write, whether you paint, you do it out of the sheer joy of not only the process, but also then the joy of the outcome of being able to create something that you can then share with others.
Yeah, I think that I really like what you said about how you can live without art. You can, I can too, but it's really what makes life worth living for, because it's what we enjoy. And I think I really want to also talk a little bit about how friendships have shaped you as a leader. In your early days of leadership, were there people that really you sort of clung on to and then you seeked advice from? And how was that different from your mentors? How were the questions that you asked your friends different from the questions that you asked your mentors?
Yeah, here's where I wish I didn't draw a distinction so much in those early days, because I think I would have learned so much more. I used to have this distinction of, with my friends, what I used to do was, to my friends is where I would vent and kind of complain, let all of my negativity out with my friends. Whereas with maybe people who were mentoring me, I felt like I didn't have an outlet, and it was not because they didn't give one, but I just somehow had this false notion that with your bosses, with your mentors, you just present the best version of yourself. But I realized that that was limiting to my own growth, because without being able to be open with my mentors, with my coaches, it didn't give them a more accurate basis to coach me. Because if I was constantly trying to put all my challenges aside and only present the best version of myself, then there was only so much guidance they could give me. Whereas if I look back and think, well, if I treated my mentors more like friends, then I probably would have learned a lot more. Because by maybe going to them with my very complaining nature, first and foremost, I probably would have been told earlier on, Leon, you got to maybe stop complaining so much, and maybe you've got to have a bit more of an attitude of gratitude. But I think from there, I would have also been able to get a lot of coaching, objective and practical coaching through the stuff that I was going through. So if I was complaining about something, then maybe first correction in posture, but actually out of that practical wisdom in terms of, okay, well, that, so you've said that this is a problem. How can we fix it, and how can we work through it together? So I think that was maybe a false distinction that I created earlier on, and I wish that I didn't do that, because much later when I started to get the balance right, I realized how much more enriching that was. Both ways, for my friendships, because it meant I had an outlet elsewhere and I wasn't just bringing negativity to my friends, but it also meant that I was able to get proper coaching.
Yeah. I want to circle back to something that you said earlier about having an attitude of gratitude. I think sometimes when we make friends, it's very easy to have a version of the friend that we make up in our head and that we want to go for. I think it's really important to be grateful for the people around you. And as Christians, I think we can believe that actually God has put people in our lives for a reason, and the people around us. Could you speak into gratitude and what's maybe a practical way of practicing it? Because it's very easy to say, oh, I'm grateful. But what does being grateful actually look like? And what does it actually mean to be grateful? Does being grateful mean just to be happy with what you have and to not want to strive for more? Or does being grateful look like trying to understand like what exactly the situation is? What do you think?
I think gratefulness becomes very real when we anchor it on the people that we're with. So that goes back to, your anchor point on relationship, right? It's harder to be grateful when we try to exercise gratefulness devoid of the humans that we are grateful for. And so that's why I believe that as not just as Christians, and why we encourage people to be in community, but even for secular workplaces. I think if you don't invest in relationships with people around you, whether it's your higher ups or whether it's your teams that are supporting you, then it generally becomes quite difficult to be grateful. You become grateful when you're proximate with your teams and you see the stuff that they do for you. You become grateful when out of that trust and relationship, people are able to come alongside you and say, hey, you know what, this is not really my project or my scope, but I see that you're maybe struggling here, and I wonder if you needed an extra hand. It's in relationship that we get pockets of, or rather opportunities to see things in others that then as a result make us hugely grateful for the things that are happening around us. And so I think gratefulness can only really be experienced in the context of community and in the context of relationship.
Yeah. Do you think that workplace friendships are risky?
Yeah. What do you think? As someone who's kind of like newer into the workplace, have you found there to be maybe a difference from, friendships with, let's say, your peers at school, college, or even with teachers versus now coming into a work environment?
Yeah, there is a difference. And actually, I don't think they're risky. I think everything in life is risky. It's your risk appetite that matters. And I think for me, workplace friendships have really made all the difference. Shout out to Caleb, who's standing right there. Caleb's the head of audio here at HTBB. But I remember very early on, like while I was still interning, Caleb always approached me in a posture of friendship and making it clear to me that I had a friend in him. And so then when we had difficult conversations or conflicts, I always knew that I could really trust Caleb, because actually from the very beginning, I've always known that I've had a friend in him. And I think that when we think about workplace or leaders, it's very important that the people that we're working with know that they can trust us. It's very important. Actually, one of my relatives said this the other day. It's very important that our colleagues have our backs. Because there's so many times where we're not going to be able to have our backs, and we're going to be in conversations where we won't be able to say something because we're not a part of that conversation. But it's absolutely necessary that the people that we're working with trust each other. Trust makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And so even working on this podcast, I think one of the reasons why I've been able to go at it and try my best is because I know I can trust Caleb. I know I can trust you. I know I can trust all the people, all the crew, everyone that's a part of it. I know that I can really trust these guys. And I think that's why that this has been working well. I mean, we've had some struggles, but it's why it's been going. And I think that's what a project needs to do, right? A project needs to keep running. You got to just start. And I think trust is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and you mentioned struggles earlier. Maybe do you want to speak into how does trust allow you to then navigate struggles with teams, with people around you?
I think it helps us stay positive. It's as simple as that. I think sometimes when we go through a struggle, it can be very easy to be negative and to assume the worst. But I think it's actually trust that provides that positivity. I think it's trust, it's that kind of background in your head voice that's no, actually, it's going to be okay. This is not the end. Or there's going to be a way out. There's a different way that we can look at this. And it's trust, I believe, that really does that. Even in my personal walk with God, there's so many moments where I'll pray prayers of complete confusion, but it's trust that keeps me going. It's trust that keeps me praying. And that's why I think trust is so important.
Yeah, and it's the trust that allows us to know that we can pray those prayers of confusion.
Exactly.
The prayers don't have to be these perfectly tidy, packaged prayers, but actually sometimes the best times of prayer are the prayers of confusion, as you said. But also, you talked about this idea of, not to put Caleb on the spot here, but him saying to you very early on and establishing, don't forget that I'm also your friend.
Yeah.
How has that kind of trust and friendship allowed you guys to also navigate trickier conversations? Because I think that's what trust gives margin for as well, right? When you invest in relationship, it also gives you margin to have difficult conversations, but difficult conversations in the interest of helping each other to be better.
Yeah.
So how has that worked out for you? And you don't necessarily have to use Caleb as an example if you don't want to, but you can, if you want, you can talk about other examples too.
I think it's helped me navigate because it starts at the right spot, if that makes sense. I think if you have a grievance with someone and you're trying to work something out or have a difficult conversation, then the both of you aren't starting at the right place. I could be starting from my perspective, my point of view, and the other person could be starting from their point of view. And so therefore, when we're trying to solve the problem or try to have that difficult conversation, we're coming from completely different angles. But I think it's that trust that puts us in the same spot, if that makes sense. I think that's what I have found, not just with Caleb, but actually with my parents, with my friends. It's that trust that actually is the reminder that we're working for the same goal, and that's to make this work, to get this project to work, to get this relationship to work. And I guess that's how I've navigated it, is knowing, okay, we're going to start from the same place, and that's wanting to resolve this, or that's us wanting to see where this could go. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. It goes back to, I think, again, if we go back to that question that some people might have in terms of, well, isn't this talk of investing in relationship as leaders, doesn't that make you very soft as a leader? Actually, it's quite the opposite, because actually, as you invest in relationship, that again gives you margin to have difficult conversations. It gives you margin to have, maybe to give feedback, or even to give maybe sometimes more stern correction where needed. I mean, if we look at Jesus completely admonishing, completely admonishing Peter, telling him, "Get behind me, Satan," and yet Peter wasn't completely butthurt by that. But I think that's because he. I can't believe I said that word. Maybe you can take that out. But, that did not come at the expense of their relationship, because he had already invested so much in that relationship, to the point where he was able to be so direct and so blunt with him, because A, he had that margin, but also B, because in having that, I'm sure Peter wouldn't have thought, oh, why did Jesus say that about me? But he rather probably would have felt, you know what, I think I've maybe done some wrong here. Because he knows that ultimately he's loved by Jesus, he's loved by his leader. And so for leaders out there, I'm not saying that this gives you an opportunity to scold people, but what we're saying is that we're not saying that you're supposed to just be nice. There's a difference between niceness and kindness. You know, Jesus was a kind person, wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say he was a nice person, because he was perfectly okay with maybe sometimes offending people, flipping tables at the market, you know, but he was kind. And sometimes in order to be kind is also to correct and steer out of love.
Yeah. I think it was Rich Wilkerson that said this in one of his sermons about love not needing to look nice. And he was talking about drawing boundaries. And I think that's something that we should touch on as well, because I think often, especially in the Christian space, it's often that we say, like, just forgive and forget. But does that apply to someone that's actually going through something that's toxic or even abusive?
Yeah.
I think that's very important to acknowledge and be aware of. And so what do you think that looks like? How do you draw a boundary when it feels so difficult to, and when you feel like you want to do the right thing and be kind and forgiving, but you know that the boundary needs to be drawn?
Yeah, so I think there are some practical ways that we try to do that here at HTBB. You know, there's obviously that tension of, I think, common narrative now in the secular workplace is there's a lot of talk about, oh, actually, you know, calling your workplace and your workmates family, that there's a certain level of toxicity to that. And to a degree, I agree, because sometimes some workplaces can actually use that as a way to weaponize a little bit, you know, and almost to manipulate. Yeah. It's like, if we're family, then if you were to leave one day for another opportunity, then are we, you know, there can be a tendency to say, oh, you're sort of betraying the family, if you like. And also this idea of workplace as family can also be used as a way to dilute or dissolve certain boundaries, because if we're a family, then aren't we always supposed to be at each other's beck and call? You know, does being a family mean that if I send you a message or an email at 3 a.m. That I expect you to reply as a member of my family? Now, obviously, I think in this context, in a Christian context, we can't completely remove that idea of workmates as family, because by definition, as Christians, we are all family. We're one big global family united by Christ. So we can't completely remove that. But having said that, I think we can remind ourselves of what a proper posture of family can look like in a work context. So what we do here is, you know, we encourage certain boundaries. Do I think that we can 100% adhere to the boundaries all the time? No. But we do set certain boundaries. So, for example, you know, as much as possible, we try to make sure that there is a discipline of rest. So whenever there are big events, like we've just come out of a huge conference here, the Alpha Regional gathering, out of that, naturally, people would say, okay, take 2 days replacement. I mean, that's standard practice anywhere you go. So similarly, we encouraged people to take their replacement leave. But then I think what we maybe do a bit more intentionally here is making sure that we take that very quickly after. Sometimes the tendency, and I'm guilty of this as well, is that if I know that I've accumulated replacement leave, I'll think, well, why don't I just kind of save it for some time later? That sort of becomes a little bit counterintuitive to the point of replacement leave, because the replacement leave is not really given so that you can add that up to a longer holiday that you plan to take in the future. But it's actually, the replacement leave is to recognize that you've gone above and beyond for that particular season. So actually the thing that you should do first and foremost is to rest. And the rest only truly feels like rest if you rest right off the back of that event. So discipline of rest. And then out of that, in terms of a general day-to-day, week-to-week, you know, we generally try to encourage people not to work past certain hours. Now, of course, sometimes if there need to be things that are maybe communicated outside of work hours, you know, there's a practice of maybe putting up a message first to say, in brackets, work message, please feel free to reply tomorrow. I'm just dropping this here before it slips my mind. So there's certain language that we put out there, which sort of still communicates a bit of a sense of boundary. And, to be honest, this is something that I think we as a church are still continuing to work on. These are existing systems, but, I think will be not really, wouldn't really be genuine to the mission if we weren't also recognizing that at times there will probably be a need to maybe change some of these boundaries or reinforce certain things. So I think that's one way that we create or try to create a bit of boundary while also maintaining a bit of this family thing, but not in the toxic way.
Yeah. We've talked about if workplace friendships are risky. We've talked about setting boundaries, but I think it'd be really good if we can actually sort of answer the question, why should I invest? I think there might be people listening to this, and I myself have been hurt by friends before, and I think it's very easy to harden your heart and then to not want to invest in friends. So what would you say to those people that are listening to this and thinking, yeah, actually, why should I even invest in friends? Yeah, sure, like community is great. Sure, maybe friendships are risky, but actually, why? Why should I invest? What would you say?
Yeah. I always encourage people that they should invest because it is risky and because it is hard. It's harder for you to be a leader that invests in people because by investing in the people, then you raise the stakes, right? If you do something wrong, then on the one hand, if you lead them well, then it's so rewarding to lead someone well and to have them, really, really also come alongside you and be so appreciative of your leadership stemming from relationship. But also if we do that, then if we get it wrong, it can also be hugely disappointing. But I think, isn't that what we're all after, this kind of pursuit of character formation as well? John Ruskin, he has this, it's one of my favorite quotes ever. He says, the real reward for a person's toil or work is not what they get out of it. So basically, it's not the outcome, but rather it's what they become out of it. And so I think in the pursuit of wanting to be a better leader, of wanting to be a better friend, obviously we're not always gonna get it right, but that's the whole point actually, as we navigate some of those difficult moments, even disappointments or hurts, whether we are on the receiving end or whether we're the ones who unintentionally hurt others. I believe it's all part of character formation and spiritual formation as well. And, the more difficult that is, as Christians, then the more reliant we become on God to help us to shape how we approach friendships. And so I always think that it is always worthwhile, even if you fail here and there, a few little slip-ups, it's all going to be part of your kind of character story at some point. And these are all the things that shape you as a better leader, because you learn best through experience. Not just through theory. Like you can listen to this and think, okay, these sound really good, but you're only really going to step into really improving as a leader and as a friend once you've actually gone through the hard work and even the pain of investing in relationship. So to me, always worthwhile. Always invest in friendships and relationships, whether in work, whether with your family, whether with your friends.
Yeah, I think it was Harvard that did a study, and it was 61% of leaders that reported feeling lonely.
61%.
61%. And I think I want to ask you, what does that leadership gap look like when it comes to friendships? I love what you said about, yeah, absolutely, you should always invest in friendships, workplace, family, like just invest, because it makes all the difference. It really does. And so I want to ask you, for someone that maybe is in leadership or leading a project, leading from wherever they're leading from, do they need to be intentional about creating a gap? Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there should always, in terms of a gap, I would say the only thing that maybe as a leader you don't want to entirely divulge is maybe too much of your own struggles. And that's not to say don't be vulnerable with people, but I think there's a degree of, if you are supposed to kind of shepherd people who are maybe struggling,
Yeah.
that there's an element where sometimes you have to put your own struggles a little bit to the side. And I use the word a little bit because you don't want to completely give this idea that I'm this perfect person, I have no issues.
Yeah.
Because actually, if you present that kind of an idea or that kind of image to your teams, then if you're now giving them advice, if you are journeying with them through stuff, it almost doesn't give you credibility
Yeah.
to understand and to speak into their situation, because to them it's like, why should I trust you, because it doesn't seem like you go through the things that I'm going through. So there is a level of having to connect with them, but also not sit in the pit with them. You know, if people are in the pit, you've got to be able to have a hand in the pit so that you can reach out and grab them. But if you are fully in the pit with them, then you can't do anything to come out either. So I think that that's probably a way to visualize proximity to people's problems and also relating to people's problems. You want to relate, but you also want to have a slight distance away from the problem so that you're in a position to pull them out. And sometimes that can feel a bit lonely, because I think the natural stance, especially if you are generally a people's person, is that you just want to sit with them in that moment. And you'd also probably feel like, you know what, I'm also going through this. So you know what, as friends, I also just want to share all of my burdens with you. But that's not always the most helpful thing. And so sometimes I think the fact that we have to put certain things aside can create a little bit of a gap. And sometimes it creates a bit of loneliness, because I think at a certain point, if you realize that there are less people sort of maybe sitting at the same level as you that you can do that with, then naturally you might start to feel, well, I don't have as many outlets anymore to be able to share my own struggles. So it can be lonely. And sometimes even if you're not the one that imposes maybe certain things that you keep aside, I think sometimes by having the mark of a leader, then especially in a work environment, sometimes it could be the team that imposes a bit of a distance of like, oh, okay, so-and-so was a peer before, but now that they're at a certain place of authority, positional authority, maybe I should also be a bit more careful about what I share, you know, in case that affects my performance review or whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, there is a slight loneliness, but ultimately, again, I think that's all part of the cost of leadership as well. Because I think in order to lead, I think the definition of a leader is someone who's able to stand in the future. So in order to stand in the future naturally means that you are going to be a bit lonely, because not everyone is already going to be at that place. So your role is to stand in the future, but then slowly start to rally people to come and join you. So there naturally will be a bit of a gap in the time that it takes for you to come up with a vision. Let's say in your case, you know, creating a vision for reviving this podcast, you had to stand in the future and be a little bit uncomfortable with standing in the future, because I remember we were having conversations and you were saying, you know, I felt really on fire for this, but now that I've shared the vision, I don't really know if people are on board. And the reality is actually at that point in time, we probably weren't fully on board. But you had to deal with that uncomfortable feeling of staying in that point, staying in that future long enough until the rest of us could kind of get a sense of, okay, I think this can work. And then now we're all following you and we're doing this, and it's great.
Yeah, I really liked that analogy you used of having to pull someone out of the pit, and you can't be in the pit if you need to pull someone out. And I was reminded of growing up, my parents always used to tell me that they're not my friends. And that used to crush me as a child. I remember there was one time my mom was telling me off because I did something wrong. And I said, like, why are you telling me off? And my mom said, Sarah, I'm not your friend, I'm your mother. And that really, I remember I was like, but you're my best friend. Like, no, why would you say that? And I think as I've grown up, I've really realized actually how thankful I am that my parents always made it very clear to me that they're my parents and not my friends, because they're my leaders in a way. They're the ones that are, not to say in charge of me, but like they've brought me into this world and they're taking care of me in this world. And therefore, with their life experience, they're going to know what works and what doesn't, what's healthy and what's not. And that's what leaders have to do. They've got to stand in the future. They've got to know what's healthy and what's not healthy, what's caring for someone and what's not caring for them. you talked about how like some of the things that we implement here at HDBB, with workplace messages after hours, that's because you guys want to know what's healthy and what's not, what's caring and what's not, and that's what leaders have to have at the forefront of their mind. And I think there are times where we're going to have to adapt, and there are times where you actually will have to fully go in the pit, and then there are times where you're going to have to just pull them out. I also want to talk a little bit about how do you shift the narrative when someone is maybe expecting something that you know is not right, and you're trying to voice that out to them and they're still quite hesitant. How would you do that? How would you maybe try and explain to someone why something is not healthy when they're adamant that for them they think it's healthy?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with there are some coaching conversations which are like a one-off, that you probably only have to have it one time, and then hopefully the person gets it, and then that's probably it. You don't have to do it anymore. But when it comes to someone who genuinely believes that they're not, maybe like their way is right, and you think otherwise, I think these are ongoing conversations that need to be had, and which is why in our case, I think HDBB has this kind of, I consider it odd, at least because it wasn't practiced in my previous workplaces, but this habit of having a weekly one-to-one with your line manager. I used to think, I barely even I probably only had a one-to-one with my previous managers like once a year when we were doing our performance reviews, at most maybe a quarterly thing. But to do it every week, I used to think, well, aren't I going to run out of things to talk about every single week? But I started to realize the value in that, because for the one-to-ones, there's this standard format, and you know it, Sarah. There's the first question that we ask is, where are you winning? What's going well for you? And this is a chance for for someone in your team to share the things that went well, to reflect and take stock, which is very healthy. But then we follow that up with, where are you challenged? And you notice here, we're not saying, it's not, I think you're challenged in this, but rather you're giving them the agency to be able to be the first person to bring it up. Because when you do that, if let's say, for example, someone asked me that question, and let's say I missed a deadline last week, I'd probably be more defensive about it if the other person were to be like, hey, Leon, I noticed you missed this deadline. What's up with that? Versus if they gave me the space to bring it up myself. And the reason why we want to allow for that is because out of that, we then want to obviously see how we can do better. Which brings us to the third question, which is, well, what do you think we can do differently next time? So again, you're sort of getting the person to, number one, exercise a bit of problem solving, but actually as a result of exercising problem solving, you're actually training their leadership muscle, because that is the other function of a leader, to be able to problem solve. Yeah. So it's building a bit of problem solving, but also ownership for maybe their own shortcomings, right? So you're not focusing anymore about lambasting them about what went wrong, but you're focusing them on what are some ways that we think we can solve this. And so if someone is maybe thinking that, well, I wasn't even wrong to begin with, you kind of change the frame when you just take it to, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, but actually what do you think we can do to solve it? It starts to become a little bit more objective. But then back to the point on relationship, because you don't just want to come across as throwing the ball to them and not having any sort of skin in the game as a leader. That's where you lead to the fourth question, which is, okay, well, that sounds good. And then maybe you provide a bit of steer to say, well, out of those options, maybe that option sounds good. Which then leads you to asking, how can I support you then? What can I do to help you to do that? So then it brings it back to you to say, okay, you've let them kind of bring up those things. You've maybe had a bit of feedback about it, but ultimately you're not just feeding back to make them feel bad, but the feedback is there to put the onus back on you as a leader to be able to guide them and coach them through that.
Yeah, I want to highlight the word that you used, support. I think that's what we do in friendships as well, as we support one another. And leaders, you've got to support your teams. You've got to support the people that you are leading. Coming to land, I think it's really important that we do acknowledge that friendships are difficult. They're not going to be easy. Yeah. But it's also important to enjoy the good times. and be grateful for them and enjoy them in its fullness. I think sort of the last thing I do want to ask you, Leon, is how do you kind of separate when it's time to enjoy and when it's time to not enjoy? Because it is important to enjoy. I think if there's one thing you take away from this episode, it's to enjoy your life, because you've got one of it. So enjoy it.
And we also said before this episode, let's not overthink it. Let's enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, that's how we start. Exactly. Like enjoying life is necessary, actually. It's key. What do you think?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. There's enjoyment in terms of enjoying whatever the project is together. And, while you want to enjoy it together, the reality is that there's also going to be sometimes hard work, right? In order for us to do anything of worth, usually there's going to be pressure, and there's going to be there's going to be maybe frictions. And as Christians, we often find that in the advent of a really big project or really important thing, usually the first thing that's at risk of breaking down is the unity of the team. And that's why, in Romans 12, Paul talks so much about love. And I used to think, well, if this is supposed to be your manifesto for transformation, why are you talking about love and unity so much? Shouldn't you be talking about all those other big things? But I realized it's exactly because of that. Because if we're disunited, if we're not united as a team, then that's the easiest way, actually, for us to be hindered in the work that we do. It would be far too obvious for us to, if you want to spiritualize it and imagine it as kind of the force of good versus the force of bad, the enemy, it would be far too obvious if the enemy were to say, I'm just going to put a stop to this project. I'm going to put some sort of external thing to stop it. It'd be far too obvious for us to recognize that as a spiritual attack, if you like. But if we are allowed to continue in the work, but somehow in the process of continuing that work in the heat of the fire, which is actually where the transformation happens, if in that heat we then end up becoming disunited as a team, well, that's the easiest way for something to break down. And so I think there's a need to also acknowledge that, this is probably going to be tough, but which is why the coaching conversations are important, because that maintains your kind of baseline of no matter how difficult the conversations get, no matter how difficult the work gets, we always know that we're doing all of this for a common good, but we also know that we're doing this with the security of our friendship still being intact at the end of it. So there's that. But then practical things that we do as well is, finding out ways to then celebrate after the fact, knowing that it's going to be difficult. How do we then celebrate after? So there's I think that's how we approach this sense of enjoyment versus hardship from a project standpoint. In terms of enjoyment, from a relational standpoint, I think it's also worth mentioning that there are times where, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think there are times where there are sometimes just toxic relationships that objectively need to be kind of put aside, whether for a season or indefinitely.
I'm reminded of the Bible verse, guard your heart, everything that you do flows from it. And I think that is such good advice. It's worth its weight in gold, because you've got to guard your heart, especially as a leader. You've got to guard what you're doing, because you mentioned this before, Leon, but you often lead from the overflow, and you do things from the overflow. And so you got to guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. And so if someone is taking advantage of your heart or is just outright neglecting it or treating it badly, then you've got to put that boundary, not because you don't like them, not because you don't wish ill for them, but because you're guarding your heart. And that's your right and your responsibility as an individual, not just as a leader, but as an individual.
Exactly, which goes into the area of forgiveness, because at the end of the day, we are all called to forgive our enemies. But what does forgiveness look like? And, as Christians, sometimes I have found myself personally almost having this self-imposed guilt trip of saying, well, someone's really objectively done some pretty unhealthy things to both me and my family. Does forgiveness look like I forgive you and let's continue to reinvest in that friendship? Well, I think not necessarily. I think there are times, let's say if you're in an abusive relationship, and this is not workplace related, but in the household, it's also where we exercise leadership, right? If you are in an abusive relationship, on the one hand there is this sanctity around the institution of marriage, and marriage is good, and obviously we don't want to encourage divorce because we truly believe in the gift that is marriage. But at the same time, does that mean that if let's say between a husband and wife, if the husband is physically abusive to the family, does that mean that we tell this person to stick with the relationship? I don't think so. I think obviously we try, through pastoral conversations, we try to see if there's a way that this can be managed and fixed. But if having gone through copious pastoral conversations, we see that there's actually no sign of change, then, actually we would probably encourage people to say, well, if you need to remove yourself from this situation, then that is probably the right thing to do. Having said that, even if you were to remove yourself and no longer invest in a relationship or leave a relationship, does that mean we're telling people not to forgive? No, we still forgive, but we can forgive and still be apart.
Wasn't it Nikki Gumbel that said forgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die? Something like that.
Unforgiveness.
Unforgiveness. And I think I remember actually you said this to me during one of our one-on-ones, because I was talking to you about something, and you said the truth will set you free. I remember you said it's such a simple quote: the truth will set you free. And I think you know your truth, and so forgiving someone doesn't have to look like you proving your truth to them. It's just you knowing your truth.
Correct. Correct. Well, that's exactly it.
And that wraps up this episode of On Leadership. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks for listening to On Leadership. We hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, why not share it with a friend or post it on social media? Whatever platform you're listening on, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow, and turn on your notifications to receive more great content from HTBV.